Part 1. A school roof in Kent. In the autumn of 2023, children across England arrived at school to find their buildings closed. The concrete used to build them, RAAC, reinforced, autoclaved, aerated concrete, installed in schools, hospitals, and public buildings across Britain between the 1950s and the 1980s, had been quietly deteriorating for years. Civil servants had known about it. Ministers had been warned. The money to replace it, or even to assess the full scale of the problem, had been steadily cut from the budgets available to local authorities and the Department for Education over the previous decade. So the roof stayed. And then they started to come down. George Osborne, Chancellor of the Exchequer from 2010 to 2016, had a phrase. He used it often, fixing the roof while the sun is shining. It was his way of describing austerity, the systematic reduction of public spending he and the coalition government pursued from 2010 onwards. Cutting, he argued, would make the public finances sound, so that when the next crisis came, the state would be ready. By 2023, an actual school roof in Kent had collapsed. Not metaphorically, a roof in a school that children had been sitting under. This short documentary is how we got here. Not just to the crumbling roofs, but to the deeper collapse that the roofs represent. The collapse of the social contract. The unspoken agreement between citizens and the state that taxation buys protection, that contribution buys belonging, that government exists to deliver something meaningful in return for the authority it claims, and about where that collapse leads. Because we can already see where the road is taking us. We can name the places. We can name the people who are waiting in the shadows. We are looking at Britain or the United Kingdom because it was an empire. The empire blossomed on the pain of the world and has now abandoned the social contract that it used to justify its empire, not just with the world, but even its own citizens. This is the story of austerity and how it broke the world. Part 2. What austerity actually was and what it did. The language used to justify austerity in Britain and the world was the language of the household. You cannot spend more than you earn. You have to live within your means. We've maxed out the national credit card. Labour left us with no money, or the Democrats left us with no money, or substitute the name of the government, left us with no money. The cupboard, famously, was bare. These were metaphors. And like all metaphors deployed in political argument, they were chosen because they felt intuitively correct and obscured the ways in which they were not. A national government is not a household. When a household cuts spending, it does not reduce the incomes of everyone it buys from. When a government cuts spending, it does. The economy shrinks, the tax receipts fall, the deficit perversely can grow. It is known as the austerity multiplier, the ratio of economic damage done per pound of cuts is not 1-to-1. Multiple studies, including the International Monetary Fund's own retrospective analysis of the 2010s, found it ran at roughly 1:5. For every pound cut from public spending, £1.50 of economic output was lost. Austerity, in other words, was not fiscally neutral. It was fiscally self-defeating in the short run and structurally devastating over time. The numbers are not abstract. Between 2010 and 2024, the UK undertook what the Institute for Fiscal Studies described as one of the largest fiscal adjustments in modern British history. Spending cuts amounting to 5% of GDP Local government funding was cut by roughly 50% in real terms over that period. The new Economics Foundation calculated in 2019 that UK GDP was £100 billion lower than it would otherwise have been. The Bennett Institute at Cambridge documented in 2022 that physical and social infrastructure, GP surgeries, mental health services, train stations, public libraries, bus routes had declined across most English regions. Bus routes specifically have halved across the country. For the poorest communities who rely on buses, this was not an inconvenience. It was a severance from employment, from healthcare, from ordinary civic life. 1,243 youth centers closed between 2010 and 2023. 1,938 children's centers, almost 800 public libraries, more than 600 public toilets. These are not dramatic statistics. These are domestic ones. They describe the texture of everyday life in a functioning democracy, slowly becoming less functional. They describe what a state looks like when it has decided that the people who need it most are the ones it can most afford to abandon. In 2010, there were around 60 food banks operating in the United Kingdom. By 2023, the Trussell Trust alone, the largest food bank network, was operating nearly 1,400. In the 2022-23 financial year, it distributed nearly 3 million emergency food parcels. 3 million in one of the 7 largest economies in the world. The people using food banks were not, in the main, people who had fallen through the cracks of the welfare system, through some failure of their own. They were people for whom the welfare system had been deliberately redesigned to be harder to access, less generous, more punitive, and more humiliating. The 2-child benefit cap, universal credit with its built-in 5-week wait, the bedroom tax, the regular reassessment of disability benefits, requiring the most vulnerable people in the country to repeatedly prove to contractors paid on the results that they were still ill. This is what austerity wrought, and not just on Great Britain, but the world over. Part 3. The weak state. Britain as a cautionary tale. There is a concept in political science called state capacity, the ability of a government to actually deliver what it promises, to tax effectively, to enforce its laws, to provide services that function. Britain in 2025 was a high-income country that had spent 15 years systematically dismantling its state capacity. The results are visible in almost every domain of public life. The NHS has the longest wait list in the history. The criminal courts have backlogs measured in years. In some cases, defendants are waiting 3 or 4 years for trials, during which time victims must remain in a kind of suspended justice. Prisons are so overcrowded that the government in 2023 was releasing prisoners early, not as a matter of policy, but as a matter of physical necessity. The buildings could not hold any more people. The asylum system processes application at a rate that means people wait years in hotels, paid for by the state, unable to work, unable to settle, while politicians use them as evidence that immigration is out of control. The Institute for Government, in its analysis of the October 2024 budget, delivered a verdict of remarkable clarity. Most public services, it found, would be in a weaker financial position in 2025 than they had been 15 years earlier. Even with the spending announced by the Labour government, the biggest disparity between funding and need would be in the criminal courts, police, and prisons. Even maintaining current performance levels, it said, would require big improvements in productivity, measures to reduce demand, or a more generous spending settlement. It did not say this was achievable. It described what would be required and left the reader to draw their own conclusions. The question that follows from this is not simply technical. It is not a question of what the right level of public spending is, or whether there are efficiency gains to be found in public services. Those are real questions. They're not the important one to me. The important question is, what happens to a democracy when its state visibly cannot deliver what citizens expect from it? When the GP surgery has a 3-week wait, when the school roof is unsafe, when the bus that used to take you to work has been cancelled, when the court that was supposed to try the person who burgled your home or snatched your watch or your mobile phone or the bike that you needed for your work cannot be tried because the court has pushed the case back weeks, months, perhaps years. The answer, and it is not a complicated one, once you look at the evidence, is that people stop trusting the state. And when they stop trusting the state, they stop trusting the political parties that run it. And when they stop trusting those parties, they look for something else. Something that at least seems to understand that they are angry. Something that offers, if not solutions, at least the correct diagnosis of their fury. That something has a name. I mean, it has several names, actually. We'll come to them. Because this is not a story just about Great Britain, the United Kingdom, Europe. This is a story about the world. Part 4. A Ghost from the Past. Gustav Streseman's Warning. In October 1929, a German statesman named Gustav Stresemann died in Berlin. He was 51 years old and had spent 6 years as foreign minister of the Weimar Republic. The democratic government that the catastrophe of the First World War had produced. He was not just a foreign minister. Though he did serve for 6 years as a foreign minister, he, for a very short period of time, was also the Chancellor of Germany. Stresemann had by any measure done extraordinary things. He had stabilized a currency destroyed by hyperinflation. He had negotiated the Dawes Plan, bringing American loans that kickstarted the German industrial recovery. He had signed the Locarno Treaties, which reconciled Germany and France. He had won a Nobel Peace Prize, shared with Aristide Briand. He had made a shattered and a humiliated country something that looked, at least from the outside, like a functioning democracy in an increasingly stable Europe. But there was something Stresemann knew and wrote about in private, in his diaries, that his public achievements concealed. The recovery was built on borrowed money. American short-term loans that could be recalled at any moment. An 800 million mark injection of foreign capital that had no alternative source. The golden 20s of Weimar Germany were not a durable recovery. They were a performance of one sustained by external credit and his own extraordinary diplomatic skill. 26 days after Stresemann died, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. The loans were recalled. The German economy collapsed. Within 3 years, 6 million people were unemployed. Within 4 years, Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. The reason Stresemann matters here in a documentary about austerity and the politics of 2020s is not because the situation is identical. The situation is not. It is because of the structural lesson historian quotes, that prosperity built without institutional depth on a single load-bearing support will not survive the moment that support is withdrawn. And that the political consequences of economic collapse, when it falls on people, who were already angry about what had been done to them are not moderate. They're extreme. They're kind of extreme that in the 1920s, the reasonable people of Europe were completely unprepared for. Stresemann, in one of his last speeches, said something that has the quality of a warning. He said, "History uses a unit of measure for time that is different from that of the lifespan of the individual, whereas man is only too ready to measure the evolution of history by his own yardstick. The people who cut the youth centers and the bus routes and the legal aid budgets measured the consequence by their own yardstick. By the next quarterly spending review, by the next opinion poll, by whether they won the next election. History measures it differently." Part 5. The people in the shadows. Viktor Orban has just lost the election for Hungary. Viktor Orban came to power in 2010 for the second time. He was prime minister before. He was prime minister from 1998 to 2002. When he came back to power in 2010, he'd learned a very important lesson from his first term in power. The lesson was, once power has been gained in a democracy, it could be made permanent if you moved fast enough and were systematic enough about dismantling the mechanisms by which democracies remove governments they no longer want. What followed is now studied in political science faculties around the world with a kind of horrified admiration for its coherence. In a single parliamentary term, Orban and his party, Fidesz, rewrote the constitution, expanded the constitutional court from 11 seats to 15, and filled them entirely with party loyalists, handed control of the National Judicial Office to a close ally, gerrymandered the electoral map through entirely legal constitutional processes, so that winning even 50% of the popular vote would still produce a Fidesz supermajority. Pro-government businessmen bought up independent media outlets and merged them into a single entity, the Central European Press and Media Foundation. By 2025, roughly 80% of Hungary's media was controlled by Fidesz allies. It was not a coup. There were no tanks. The elections continued. The newspapers and media continued to publish and broadcast. The opposition continued to stand for office. The form of democracy remained. The substance had been methodically emptied out. Scholars call this stealth authoritarianism, a phrase coined by the legal academic Ozan Varol. The mechanism is always legal. The laws that entrench power are passed by the parliament that power controls. Courts that might challenge them have been filled with those who will not. Media that might expose them has been purchased or frightened into silence. And at every stage, the government can point to the procedure. We follow the rules, they will say. We had the votes, they will tell you. This is democracy, they will argue. It is not democracy. But it is what democracy looks like when it has been hollowed out by someone who understands its formal mechanisms better than those who want to defend it. Orban did not destroy Hungarian democracy. He converted it from a system that distributed power to one that concentrated it, using the law as the instrument of concentration. This is the new playbook. This playbook, though, did not help him. In 2026, he did lose power. But the specific conditions that enabled Orban are more important than the fact that he finally lost. Hungary had emerged from Soviet communism with democratic institutions that were young, poorly rooted, and designed by elites who were not certain which party would win. The electoral laws they wrote were inadvertently vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation Fidesz later deployed. There was disillusionment with the democratic and capitalist transition. The sense that the promised rewards of 1989 had not materialized for ordinary people, that the transition had created winners and losers, and that the winners were not them. There was a culture war available about the Christianity and migration and Western liberal values that could be used to define enemies and consolidate a base. Does it sound familiar? It should, because the conditions that produced Orban are not specific to Hungary. They're specific to what happens when states stop delivering for their citizens, when economic arrangements produce visible losers, when the political mainstream becomes so associated with management of decline that the alternative, any alternative, however destructive, feels preferable. Part 6. Trump and the American version. Donald Trump returned to the American presidency in January 2025, having spent his first term demonstrating that the democratic norms of the United States, the informal rules that gave its institutions their actual operating power, were not enforced by any mechanism stronger than convention. The United States had, for 2.5 centuries, been governed by an implicit understanding that those who held power would not abuse its formal mechanisms to entrench themselves indefinitely, because the legitimacy of the system depended on the possibility of peaceful transfer. Trump's first term showed that the conventions underpinning this understanding were not laws, they were habits. And habits can be, and often are, broken. The political scientists, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, whose book, How Democracies Die, is now one of the most cited works in political science, and incredible book to read. Go get a copy. Identified the Frankenstein problem in the Weimar context. The tendency of established conservative parties to recruit and legitimize extremist movements in the belief that they can be controlled. The Republican establishment accommodated Trump. In this case, the establishment believed it was using a radical. In this case, the radical understood the situation more clearly than the establishment did. Trump's second administration has been wobbly, to say the least. The American state is old. It's much more deep. It's institutionally resilient, but it is being tested in ways that reveal the limits of that resilience. The independence of the judiciary, of the civil service, of the military, of the press, each of these has faced pressures in forms that would have been unimaginable to the architects of the post-war American order. Some have held, some have bent. The bending is in the news, and the bending is often the news. What connects Trump to Orban, and both to the wider pattern of democratic backsliding? It's not just ideology in the narrow sense. It is the discovery that the formal mechanisms of democracy can be used against democracy's substantive commitments. And the people most likely to make this discovery are those who have calculated correctly that the mainstream democratic parties have failed their voters badly enough that the rules of the game are no longer being defended by those who supposedly believe in them. Austerity, in the European sense, did not cause Trump. The causal chain is more complex than that. Austerity, in its British form, its European form, it's in the American version of chronic underinvestment in public goods and infrastructure, created the conditions in which the argument, the system is rigged against you, and I will destroy it. Remember, one of the canonical things that Trump did when he was just a candidate in 2016 was he wanted to put Hillary Clinton in jail. I think we all remember that. But the other thing, I think everybody has forgotten, is that he wanted to drain something called as the swarm. The swarm was the system that was rigged against the people who live in Arkansas, in Nebraska, in Arizona. The people who have not gotten their dues from the world's richest superpower. This was the audience that Trump found. This was the audience that the Republican Party wanted Trump to find. The audience was not irrational. It was responding to the evidence that they had seen over the years. They'd seen successful Trump. They'd seen Trump who appeared on television, who was brash, who was on Fox, who knew what he was talking about. It is human nature to be fooled by good salesmen. People were not at fault. It was the system that the American economic order that had produced that was at fault. 7. The East sends its own signals. Sanae Takaishi and the Japanese moment. Japan is not Britain. It is not Hungary. It is not the United States. It has a different political culture, a different institutional structure, a different relationship between state and citizens that runs centuries deeper than any of the Western democracies we have examined. And yet, in October 2025, Japan elected its first female prime minister, Sanae Takaishi, a conservative nationalist who had been a protege of Shinzo Abe, who had made regular visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, the memorial that commemorates Japan's war dead, including convicted war criminals, and whose significance Beijing and Seoul raised as a signal of unrepentant nationalism, who had, in 2014, appeared in photographs with the leader of a neo-Nazi organization. In Takaishi's defense, she said she had been unaware of his affiliations. Takaishi came to power not despite these associations, but in part because of them. The LDP, which has governed Japan almost continuously since 1955, had been shaken by corruption scandals, by the revelation of deep ties between senior party figures and the Unification Church, by economic stagnation and rising prices, and an older population facing insecure retirement. The far-right Sanseto Party had made significant gains in the 2025 upper house election on a Japanese first platform. The LDP, alarmed, moved towards its own nationalist wing to hold off the challenge from further right. This is a pattern that should now be recognizable. The mainstream Conservative Party, losing support, moves rightward to compete with an insurgent far right. In doing so, it legitimizes the far right's agenda. The Overton window, the range of what is considered acceptable political discourse, shifts. And the next cycle begins from a position further from the center than the last. In Japan, as in Hungary, as in the United States, the mainstream right has responded to the far right by moving towards it. They believe they are containing the threat. They're actually feeding the threat. Takaishi, in her first policy speech, committed to major fiscal spending and faster military buildup. She navigated carefully between nationalist signals to her base and the diplomatic requirements of managing relations with China, South Korea, and the United States. She is not, in any straightforward sense, an authoritarian. Japan institutions are more robust than Hungary's. Its constitution, written under American occupation, contains deliberate constraints on executive power, but the direction matters as much as the current position. Japan's political center is shifting. The signals that were once fringe, revisionist history, assertive nationalism, the rehabilitation of wartime memory on nationalist terms, are now being managed rather than rejected by the ruling party. And the conditions that are producing this shift, economic anxiety, demographic pressure, a generation that has not experienced the prosperity their parents assumed, nay, took for granted. A sense that the post-war order no longer delivers the security it promised. These problems are not going to resolve themselves. Japan is not a harbinger in the sense that it tells us what comes next. It is a harbinger in the sense that it tells us how widely the pressures producing this political moment are distributed. This is not a European pathology. It is not an American one. It is not a Latin American one. In some form, somewhere, and everywhere, it is happening. This moment is not going away on its own. Part 8. What the broken contract produces and what can be done. There is a research finding from the 2010s that deserves more attention than it has received. A study published in the Journal of Economic History examined voting patterns in Germany during the Great Depression, cross-referencing them with the geographic distribution of austerity measures imposed between 1930 and 1933. The finding was precise. Areas that experienced the most severe austerity cuts saw the highest share of votes for the Nazi Party. The relationship was causal, not merely correlation. It's a distinction that I want you to pay attention to. Very rarely do we find causal relationship in historical data. It is very hard to do. These researchers were not retrofitting the data. They were doing detectives' work in trying to find patterns in data, which is very hard to find. Economic suffering, mediated by a sense of institutional betrayal, drove people toward the most extreme available political option. This was Germany in the 1930s. The implication for contemporary democracies that have spent 15 years implementing austerity should be handled with utmost care. And I want to do that. The circumstances are very different. The extreme available are different. The institutional resilience of democracies, in most cases, is substantially greater than what was available to people during Weimar Germany. But the basic mechanism, austerity erodes institutional trust. Eroded trust produces receptivity to anti-system politics. Anti-system politics finds its expression in the most available extreme form, appears to hold. The academic literature reviewing the political consequences of post-2008 austerity across Europe is on this point unusually consistent. Areas most affected by fiscal contraction saw the sharpest increase in support for populist and far-right parties. The correlation is strong. The causal interpretation is not really supported that well by this mechanism at this point. When the state stops working, those who promise to destroy the state gain the trust of the people. This is a warning from history. What does this mean in practice? Not that every voter who supported Brexit or Trump or Orban was directly responding to a specific cut in public services. Human political motivations are extremely complex. And I don't want to simplify this. This is not the point of this documentary. But the broad political landscape in which these movements flourished was prepared by the visible failure of democratic states to deliver on the basic promises that they had made to their citizens. The roots of the tree go down invisibly through years of managed decline. The storm that brings it down happens in a day. What can be done about this is not a simple question, but some things are clear. The first is that rebuilding state capacity is not optional. It is the precondition for everything else. A state that cannot deliver healthcare, education, safe housing, functioning courts is not simply inefficient, it is delegitimizing itself actively every day, and one day it will fail. Every year that passes in which the visible evidence of state failure accumulates, the waiting list, the crumbling school, the overflowing courts, is a year in which the argument that the system should be torn down gains a new piece of evidence. The second is that the framing matters. Austerity was presented as economic necessity. It was not a necessity. It was a political choice made within a range of available options by people who believe, with varying degrees of sincerity, that it was the right choice. The choice was wrong, on its own terms and on its political terms. Acknowledging that is not the same as solving the problem, but it is a precondition of solving the problem, because solutions built on the same faulty premise will produce the same results. The third is that the politics of the Orbans, the Trumps, the Takaishis, those who will come after them, are not going to be argued out of existence. They exist because they are responding to something real. The response is wrong, but that something that they are responding to is real. Reasonable people who want to defend democratic institutions will not do so successfully by explaining to angry people that their anger is misconceived. They will do so by removing the conditions that produces the anger. That means electing the governments that can deliver. It means strengthening institutions that function. It means a state visible enough in daily life that citizens experience. The presence of state as protection rather than its absence, which can be seen as abandonment. It means, in short, keeping the promise. The social contract is not broken by a single event. It's broken the way all contracts are broken, by small failures accumulated until the other party concludes the agreement was never serious. In the autumn of 1929, a man who had spent 6 years trying to hold a broken world together died in Berlin, utterly exhausted. 2 days after his last diplomatic achievement, he had bought his country time. Not enough. The loan on which the whole edifice depended was about to be called in. We are not in 1929. Our institutions are older and a lot stronger than they appear. Our democracies have been tested before and survived, and they will survive. But the time for the loan being called in is round the corner. The question is whether we use the time we have left wisely. Thank you for watching.